Good evening all, good evening one and all. Coming in, missing a few. We've got a great team tonight. It's another sellout tasting. Welcome to Stannary's Gevrey and Friends, Gevrey and Neighbours tasting. 6 wines hopefully have made it onto your table into glasses, some of them already. We're obviously excited about this one. As I alluded to in my email shortly, an hour or so ago, Gevrey was a real sweet spot for the vintage. This has been discussed certainly at the start of this Zoom session with Jason and Jasper, and throughout it's been brought up that Gevrey has really knocked out of the park in 19. Much it did in 18 in truth, but here we are with a selection of arguably some of the finest wines of the vintage. I'm on the controls tonight. Please pop your questions in the chat and I will I'll interrupt Jason as and when to get them out. And I will hand over to Jason. We've got 2 winemakers. Unfortunately, Charles Magnien couldn't make it. He doesn't actually have a camera on his computer. So we haven't got Charles, but we've got Mark Fixin from Domaine Tawse, and we've got the wonderful Romain Taupenot, who many of you would have met over the years. Jason, you've had a shave. I've had a sort of economy haircut. We've stepped it up a gear for tonight's tasting. Very good to see you, Jason.
Likewise, yeah, absolutely. This is Zoom number 7, and I felt I hadn't shaved it in 3 weeks, so now was the time. I didn't want to look too locked down. I'm really looking forward to this, and I hope you are as well. And in fact, not only did we lose Charles, we also lost Amélie Berthaut, who's having to look after her daughter, who's 7 or 8 months old. So sadly, she won't be introducing her Fixin tonight. Unfortunately for you, that's going to be me a little bit later on. But we have two winemakers with very extensive vineyard holdings who can hopefully provide real insight to not just the vintage, but of course to the appellation of Gevrey Chambertin. And just to echo what Tom said there, really, I was looking back through my notes whilst writing up these wines, and the Gevrey has just had an absolute cracking vintage again. It's quite interesting whether it's the soils, whether it's those slightly cooler spots that Gevrey seems to have, but it seems to be flourishing in these slightly warmer vintages without getting the heat into the wines particularly. But they're particularly as well in 19, the wines are showing amazing precision, finesse, beautiful purity, very Pinot, very Burgundian. These are some of the finest Gevreys I've certainly tasted in 15 years. So I'm really excited about that. Now we've got Romain and Mark here. I'm going to introduce them really sort of one by one, just to give a little bit of background. If I could perhaps start with you, Mark, if that's okay. So Mark is winemaker at Domaine Tawse. Obviously we had, for those of you who tuned in during our Côte de Beaune tasting, we had his wonderful Beaune Premier Cru Clos de Loire, which was tasting beautifully, wonderful aromatic quality to it, real finesse, purity, again, very Pinot, a classic example of, I think, all the good things about 2019. Good evening, Mark, welcome. Thanks for joining us here this evening. And we'll just unmute you in a second so we can get what you've got to say. But could you've obviously, you're looking after vineyards in both the Côte de Beaune and Côte de Nuits. Obviously we're focusing on Côte de Nuits this evening, but have you got an overall interpretation about both côtes and whether one is superior to the other?
Well, thanks for the introduction, Jason. I mean, I'd just like to start by saying that, you know, I share really the winemaking duties with Pascal, who was with you for the Beaune Clos de Loire, and with Thomas Dinel, who, so, you know, we make about 60 wines. So it's, I mean, as anyone would know, you know, I do very little. But anyway, I'm here happy to talk to you about that. I mean, you know, Beaune, the Côte de Beaune, we have Volnay, we have Beaune, we have Savigny. I mean, it's not as homogeneous as the Côte de Nuits. So even though you know, obviously there's great difference between Vosne Romanée, Maurice Saint-Denis and Gevrey. I mean, we're talking about, you know, a block of limestone and a little bit of a more, I would say, homogeneous climate. Sometimes it rains a bit more in Nuits Saint-Georges than it does in Gevrey Chambertin. But I think the differences can be greater in the Côte de Beaune between, say, Savigny and Volnay. Not only the climate is a little bit different, but the soils are very different. And so we're starting to see more of a change in Beaune insofar as picking dates can vary a lot between the different sites. And in the Côte de Nuit, there seems to be a little bit more still, it's more of a homogeneous terroir in terms of both the soils, obviously, but also the climate.
In terms of just talking briefly on picking dates there, Mark, when did you have much difference between the Côte de Beaune and the Côte de Nuit?
I suppose we did. We started in Beaune on September the 12th, and I know I finished picking. I picked the Champeaux on the 22nd of September, which was about the last vineyard we picked. Although we might have gone back to Beaune and picked the Pommard Saucy after that, and a couple of other things. So in 2019, it was a fairly sort of standard program where we picked in Beaune first, and then went to the Côte de Nuit. Whereas in 2018, it wasn't so much like that. So obviously, you know, it's very convenient if you can pick Beaune first and then come to the Côte de Nuit. But I think it's less and less going to be the case.
I mean, we'll talk specifically about your wine a little bit later on when we get to it. It was wine number 4. But your impressions, I mean, you mentioned it was very consistent across the Côte de Nuit, but your impressions of Gevrey as a whole in 2019, and do you also think perhaps these, what were once considered cool sites, are now really coming to the fore?
Well, I suppose so. I mean, I think Champeaux is a cool site insofar as it's often the last vineyard we pick in the whole of Burgundy. Is Gevrey a cooler terroir than Nuits Saint-Georges? I mean, it's never really my impression that that's the case. I think so. In some respects, I sort of, you know, I've heard people say it was Gevrey did extremely well in those years. I just think since we've been there, which is only really 2012, I mean, just overall the standard of farming has improved so much in Gevrey Chambertin, and I think the style of wine, people are making slightly more elegant wines than they perhaps did in the past, and that all contributes to it. I don't think I'd be enough of an expert to really put my finger on there being, you know, I don't think Gevrey is necessarily any fresher than, I sort of think Nuits Saint-Georges is more of a cooler spot, but I think also it doesn't seem to suffer too much from dryness, and that was certainly important in 2019.
Okay, thanks, Mark. I'll just bring Romain in a way on the same question. Obviously, Romain, you've got you know, great vineyards across the Côte de Nuit, in Nuits Saint-Georges, Maurice Saint-Denis, and of course Gevrey Chambertin, where we are this evening, and we'll be tasting one of your 2 Grand Crus from there, the Chambertin later. But you've also got the Gevrey, one of my favourite wines that you make, the Gevrey Bel Air, which is famously a very cool site high above the What's your take on Gevrey and 2019?
Well, I would say that 19, you know, it's kind of quite paradoxal, because 19 is probably the first vintage where it has never been so hot, and despite the fact the vintage has been very hot, we probably make a great vintage with very nice freshness overall. And I think in the vintage like 19, you encounter lots of differences into the wine depending on the type of the soil. If you have a deep soil of clay that is able to keep water inside, then the vines won't suffer that much. If you have soil, poor soil, which is about 15 to 30 centimeters of earth, and just beneath you have the limestone or rocky soil, then the vine may suffer. And if you have old vine or young vine, you know that the root system is not developed as the same. So in vintage like 19, we encounter quite a lot of discrepancies, and Gevrey is kind of a good demonstration. If you take the base, the area of Les Crais de Paille, which is in the cone of alluvion, of the cone de Lavaux, you would have very shallow soil there, and the vine have been suffering quite a lot from hydric stress, and about 2 to 3 weeks before the harvest, you know, it was naturally, there have been some naturally leaf pooling. There was, you know, a lot of leaves that are falling down, that has fallen down. And whereas if you take at the opposite, vine that are located in Mazoyer, where, you know, it's a little bit higher in terms of clay, you have higher level of clay, you have some colluvion, so it's very quite deep compared to that vineyard. So this vineyard is hardly suffering. Plus the fact that Mazoyer is very old vine, you know, the root system is plunging, and so there are really discrepancies. If you take the example of Bel Air is on altitude, and this benefits from the cool environment, because, you know, between the Comte de Grisard, which is separating the La Trissière and the Chambertin, and the Comte de Lavaux, you always have some pressure which is circulating. This, you know, even if in 19 it was very hot and we encounter about 5 weeks of temperature ranking between 35 to 40 degrees during daytime, it was a little bit cooler in that area, and the vines benefit a bit. So at the same level of ripeness, you may end up with a high level of acidity in vineyards like Bel Air. So, you know, it's not that easy, and especially in a hot vintage. And if I share the idea with Mark that overall in Côte de Nuit generally benefited from the evolution of the global warming evolution, and the fact that 19 was a hot vintage, this is quite, you know, very specific to the area, to the age of the vine, to the type of the soil that you have. And I would just add an additional information from what Mark said is we have very few vineyards in Côte de Beaune. They're located in Saint-Romain and Cazetiers, and they really benefited from the evolution of the global warming. And I should say, normally we harvest the white after the red in Côte de Nuit and even Côte de Beaune. But for this time, in 19, I've been harvested the whites probably at that was on the 3rd day. So it was even before the middle of the harvest, because they were quite in advance for the Chardonnay. So I think, you know, by these days, there is no common rules. Over the last 5 vintage, the order of how to proceed with the harvest time has changed. And you can start radically with harvesting, for instance, the Comte d'Orvaux right after the Corton on our vineyards. And in some vintages, you can end by the Comte d'Orvaux because, you know, the hydric stress, the fact that it was very hot, has causes some, you know, some slowdown in the evolution of the vines. So this is becoming more and more specific, more and more actually difficult to plan everything. Sorry, I'm talking a lot.
No, thanks very much. That's very interesting, actually. In fact, just before I get on to the first wine, I'll just throw a question quickly back to Mark again. Something Romain touched on and I've been thinking about as well, the importance of old vines in 2019. Can't be underplayed, it seems. in terms of stress.
I think that's probably true. And I mean, as you know, we're quite lucky that we have a high proportion of old vines. But I would say that one of the vineyards, which is a little bit younger, was the one, I mean, in Gevrey Chambertin, we have a very nice piece of Justice. And that vineyard, the vines are a bit younger. They're only about 25 years old. And certainly, you know, I have more of a problem there with leaves dropping early. And as Romain said, the Mazoyer, where we also have a vineyard, you know, it's not a vineyard which is where we are anyway, right on the bedrock. I mean, it's actually got quite good soil, and it's probably my wine, you know, with the best pH. Because I think the point is that often you have, Romain made a very good point, that you have wines with the same maturity, but they might have different acidities. And it's the old vines which tend to have the better acidities and the lower pHs. And so that's what, you know, for the same alcohol, you can have a great feeling of freshness in a wine with a lower pH and a higher total acidity. And certainly the old vines help in that respect.
Yeah, great. Well, that's very interesting. Thank you, Mark. Well, we'll come back to you a little bit later. I think we should probably start tasting. Sadly, you've got me for the first couple of wines here. But we're going to kick off with the 2019 Fixin Crais from Domaine Berthaut-Gerbet, which of course is Amélie Berthaut. Now, we tasted one of her wines at the Vaux Nuit tasting, so we'll talk about her development a little bit, but she basically took over from her father in 2013. And we were really lucky enough to be there kind of about 6 months before she did that. We were very lucky. It was one of those very exciting moments where we got to taste the wines that the father made, and then we got to taste what she was about to bottle. And whilst what her father was making was good, absolutely fine, what she was making somehow was just a bit more exciting. And the fact that at the time she would have been about 25, you just think, oh, this is someone who's really going places. She had that look in her eye, a sort of determination and a curiosity, I think, which is often a key for me. It's always difficult when you meet a winemaker for the first time. You know, what can your meeting tell you about how good they're going to be going forward? You can taste a range of wines and they can be impressive, but are they really going to develop as winemakers? And I think there is just something in someone's eye as a winemaker that gives you that confidence, and Amélie certainly had it. And she's very charming, but she's quite steely as well. She knows exactly what she wants. So I was pretty confident from day one that she was going to be something special, and so it's proved. So she took over, as I say, back in 2013. She's now got 18 hectares in total. She's also acquired some from her mother, who's from the Gerbet side, who has vineyards more in Romain and Clos Vougeot. So she's now got an amazing mix of Fixins, mainly from her father, but also some what we might consider slightly more grandiose vineyards from her mother. So it's a great combination. And going forward, there may be more to come in time. But for now, I think with 18 hectares, she's got plenty on. She works organically. She's not certified. Interestingly, she at the moment, up until this vintage, really, she hasn't used a lot of whole bunch. But I think, like a lot of people, perhaps she used a little bit more in 19 than she had done previously, as we discussed in these tastings before. It's a really good vintage for whole bunch, it seems. Not only the ripeness of the stems, but also in bringing that much needed freshness and vitality to the wines, I think. So yeah, generally she was working around 20-25%, where she kind of flirted with whole bunch in the past. And the wine we're going to taste today is Fixin Crais. It's one of her bigger holdings, 1.3 hectares. It's right bang in the middle of Fixin, from alluvial soil, so not too heavy at all. Gives a nice freshness. I said before, if you go back and look at old books, Fixin was very highly regarded as an appellation back in the day. I remember seeing a wine list, probably dated sometime, I guess, around 1900, where the Fixin was actually the same price as Clos Vougeot, which today seems extraordinary. But I think that perhaps suggests the potential that's there if the village becomes reignited by winemakers such as Amélie, really. Yeah, she's up to 30% stems on here. A lot less pigeage than like a lot of people, than perhaps normal. She only just did a little bit right at the end of fermentation. Other than that, she was happy with just pump overs. Colours came very easily. Tannins came very easy. There was no need to force it too much. So that was great. She managed to keep that sort of seamless texture about it. Alcohol level remained very sensible. We're well under 40. Well, I say well under, about 13.7, 13.8, and we're at about 20% new oak. The only negative I can really say is that she lost about 30% of crop, but I think that's a fairly common problem in 2019. So you'll have to be very nice to us if you want some of these wines. Yeah, I mean, there's certainly plenty of concentration there. Slightly darker fruits than some of the 19s I've tasted. So clearly very ripe, good maturity. There is that telltale freshness of 2019 that just kind of lifts it at the end and stops it becoming heavy. I would imagine there's enough substance and matière there to potentially shut that wine down for a little bit post-bottling. I know Amélie had a lot of very small berries, which not only concentrated the acidity, but clearly concentrated the juice as well. And I think that comes across, it's quite a compact wine. So yeah, I think it'd be a shame to be fooled into drinking that too soon, even though it's quite expressive and gives the impression that it's quite open. I think the structure will kind of take over for a little bit. So yeah, I'd probably look at drinking that in starting in about 3 to 5 years, and then probably just keep going as long as you like. I think we've got some magnums. So if you've got magnums, you can probably wait double those figures and still be drinking that with great pleasure in about 15 years' time. So that's Amélie's wine. Fixin, obviously look out for her offer. We've got Vosnes and Champeaux and Rouges and everything from her. So it's a real mix of vineyards. So sadly, the quantities are quite small. Moving on to wine number 2. Again, I'm having to be Pierre Duroche because he's actually fishing this evening. But I can't imagine how cold. I guess he's not fishing this evening, but he's been fishing today. But I don't know how cold it is in Burgundy at the moment. But that's going to be quite an experience. The alert amongst you will have spotted these are not quite the same bottles as the other ones. He bottled these himself about 10 days ago and then sent them off to us, so they haven't had the normal 67 treatment. Those of you who are cleverer than I am probably didn't try and open it with a corkscrew, bearing in mind it's a screw cap. So I now have a screw cap with a little hole in it, but thankfully I can have access to the wine. Pierre, in a way, is a bit like Amélie for us, but kind of 5 years. Well, he came five years sooner. We first came across him with his 2008, and actually at that time no one was importing his wines at all, and they're probably very different to how they are today. They probably were very different now today, but they did show something. And I think what was appealing about them at the time is that they had a certain finesse and subtlety about them. He wasn't trying to overforce them, and in a way I'd much rather someone starts out that way and adds concentration than is over extracting. And generally I'm not sure that you typically come back from that. So whilst the wines here are relatively light, I like their purity of fruit and I like their definition, if you like. And obviously as the years have gone by, I need some more work in the vineyards, so the wines have got more concentrated. So so on that basis is going to be our 11th vintage, I think. Sadly, yields seem to go down every year. Partly as well, I think yields, not only yields go down, but I think when we started, he was exporting to maybe 2 countries. Well, we became the second, shall we say, and now he's exporting all over the world. So sadly, we're having to compete against global demand. So this is a wine we don't always show on Primeur, actually, interestingly enough. It's a basic Gevrey Chambertin. So we often would show Genois, single vineyard. If we're feeling really flush, we might show the Eteloir, which is a brilliantly located vineyard just near Coillot. I know Mark has a little bit of Eteloir. I think we have a very small allocation, which is very exciting. But this is his humble little vineyard, which is made with all the sort of due care and attention of all of his other wines, but it's perhaps just a little bit more accessible. He doesn't use a lot of whole bunch. He's used a little bit more perhaps than some vintages, save for his Griot where he's 100% because he makes about half a barrel, so he has it's either 100% or nothing at all really. But generally in 2019 he's been about 10 to 15%, so just a little bit of seasoning to help freshen up the wines. One important thing to say is one of the reasons we've got these samples and not 67 versions is that Pierre was actually bottling the wine about 3 days after we had planned to pick up the cast samples. That made sense to actually let him bottle. So we've actually got the finished version. So actually, I think that will be the sole wine this evening that's actually bottled. But again, there's no real sense of heat there. There's plenty of power from the vintage, of course. But I know generally a lot of Pierre's wines in 2019 were coming in around between 13 and 13 and a half. So not excessive at all. There's still just enough nice freshness and bite to that and really good definition. So yeah, for a humble village Gevrey, that's really quite exciting. And if you think that's kind of the bottom of his range, all the other wines are even better than that, then that's really good news. Again, yeah, there's not much. Yields are about 30% down on 2018, and I don't want to depress you even more, but 2020 is even worse. We're about 50% down on 2018. So yeah, not a lot of wine, but clearly what there is very high quality. Right. Final wine before I hand back to Mark to talk us through his wine. So this is part of the Gevrey and Friends wine. So this is a Marsannay Boivins from Domaine Coillot. Obviously he's based in Marsannay. Basically makes 3 or 4 different cuvées of Marsannay, some Bourgogne and a Gevrey Chambertin. And if I could just, oh Christ, this is, there we go. 67 certainly do pack these well. There's no chance of any oxidation happening to that wine. Marsannay is interesting. It's probably slightly heavier soil than much of Gevrey Chambertin. We're just a little bit further north, if you like. And there's been talk for God knows how many years now about the Premier Cruise being verified, being ratified, really. It still hasn't actually happened yet, but I guess when it does, let's say when rather than if, I'd like to think that Boivins is probably one of the ones that would become Premier Cru, probably along with Longerois, which is also very well known. This is probably the pick of Christophe's 12 hectares of vines. As he makes Grass Tête as well, and Longerois. Boivins, a little bit more structured, a little bit more powerful. Christophe actually likes to pick relatively early. He likes his grapes to be ripe, but he doesn't like them to be too heavy. He likes them to retain a certain crunchiness. He doesn't keep stems. He uses about 20% new oak. And what we tend to find is the wines are, after about 2 or 3 years, are wonderfully expressive and just full of fruit, really.
Jason, I've had my sample open for an hour or so. Initially, it was very backward and structured. It's opening up in my glass, but I can see why you positioned this in the tasting after the verse 2. It's got great.
Yeah, when I looked at it on the map this evening, I think maybe should we put it in at number 2? But actually, you're right. It is still quite powerful. And I don't, as you saw, I only just opened mine that minute, and yeah, it is certainly quite structured. I mean, we've probably never drunk these wines older than about 6 or 7 years old, but it strikes me that probably has the intensity to go longer than that. Whether you need to get the real pleasure out of it, it's hard to say. I would think, yeah, 4 or 5 years will be absolutely fine. But yeah, clearly it's not a shrinking violet. But I wouldn't say it's wine with lots of extraction. I think that's a natural concentration. He's allowing the terroir to speak. As I say, there's a reasonable amount of clay in that soil, and I think that the structure and the power really comes from that, rather than anything that Christophe is doing in the winery or in the Gevrey. So yeah. Yeah, just a really nice glass of Pinot, I think, with a little bit of extra stuffing from the vintage. That's my little walk through those three wines sans vigneron. Let's move back to Mark, if we may. So, Mark, this was when I came to taste with you. I think when it was now, was it mid October, something like that? I think this wine immediately got me excited. I mean, I think we probably tasted, I don't know, 20 wines, something like that. And this was such a standout in terms of fragrance, precision, character, good typicity as well. Is there anything just about the vineyard itself? Is there anything very special about the vineyard?
I think so. I mean, I think, I'd like to just quickly talk about the vineyard. For those who don't know, Champeaux, it's on the northern end of what is called the Côte Saint-Jacques in Gevrey Chambertin. So that's more towards the side of Brochon. The Champeaux as a whole is quite small. It's 6.67 hectares. And sadly, we only have a small piece, so we have about 1/4 of a hectare. But the vineyard itself is divided into 2 terraces. It's quite interesting because it's very flat, but there's terraces. And we're in, let's say, the upper terrace. So my neighboring vineyards, it's quite high. The altitude is about 380 meters. The neighbors are just above us are the Combeaumois and Les Goulots. So the interesting thing about the vineyard is it faces directly east. Sometimes in the summer, if you get there early in the morning, about 10 to 6, you can see the sun come up over the Mont Blanc, which is about 400 kilometers away. So, I mean, it's quite a unique site. So I think, why I mention that is because it's that contributes to the freshness of the wines, because the vineyard gets a lot of light, but it doesn't get quite as much of the hot afternoon sun that you'll find in, say, Lavaux Saint-Jacques or even in Massy-Chambertin. So that's important. The other thing is the soil is quite unusual for Gevrey Chambertin. It's sort of a red ochre color. And the subsoil, the substratum is what is called in France the crenodial limestone, or which just basically means, those are fossil remains. Cazetiers is another great example of that, with a lot of very fine fossils. So that also contributes a minerality to the wine. But because there's quite a nice, there's some clay in this red ochre, again, it's a vineyard that doesn't suffer from any sort of hydric stress. Even in a dry year like 2019, the leaves were, when we picked late September, I had a very sort of complete vineyard in front of me. So I think that was important. So you sort of the freshness, and then curiously enough, it's also, other vineyards will say this in Gevrey, it's one of the more elegant sites in Gevrey. And just tasting the wine today, I'm always sort of struck by the elegance and the finesse in Champeaux. And I think that you know, that's sort of very important, and it's quite, I think you'll find this in most examples of Champeaux. I have to say, I think the upper terrace where we are gives wines with a little bit more finesse. Down below, there's a little bit more soil, and the wines can be a bit bigger. I mean, you're sort of getting more to the similar wines like Enchant. So you have sort of three levels. You have Enchant, which is the village, the first level of Champeaux, and then the top terrace, which is a little bit higher. Just quickly to our farming, not everyone will know that we're biodynamic in the vineyards, and we're certified organic. So the 2019s that you're tasting actually is our first year of full certification. So we'll have the organic symbol on the label. We plow the vineyards with a horse. Everything is, we do the biodynamic preparations. And for me, you know, it's a very country vineyard, very healthy. We have walls on two sides and a road. I have a wild cherry tree in the vineyard, and I think this sort of is part of what contributes to the wine. So just very quickly on the wine itself, we usually use about 20% whole bunch. Actually, I don't generally use very much whole bunch in Gevrey Chambertin, but I like that element in Champeaux. I think it adds a floral touch to the wine, but also for me, it corresponds actually to the external aspect of the vineyard. I feel it's up in the country there, and so it's also partly, you know, sometimes things aren't entirely rational. It sort of seems to correspond to the vineyard, and perhaps, you know, we might up that in the future. So sort of just 20% whole bunch. Again, what you were saying earlier about vinification, I think I've certainly changed my methods in the last few years. I mean, I try and vinify at lower temperatures. I mean, basically, there was a point where you needed to push wines quite hard, I think, to reveal the terroir. And with vintages like 2019, perhaps even 2020, it's not that you have to put a brake on it, but the concentration will come anyway. And so you don't need to work it too hard. You know, you have ripeness, and it's you sort of, I think it's necessary a little bit to back off. We help that because I think one other thing we do, we like to try and pick a little bit before the physiological maturity. I think sometimes if you wait now in Burgundy, you might find that your alcohol levels are too high. So, you know, if you're picking at 90% maturity, that's fine. You know, it always used to line up, but I think now you have to think a little bit more about these things. Then other than that, it's very classic 21-day fermentation, maceration, mainly pump overs. Perhaps I'm trying to keep the temperatures further down. I used to always look for a peak of 32 or something like that. Now I like it to be more like 26, 28. And I think that helps, gives the freshness. So I've got the wine here. I would say, you know, one thing I think that comes through in a lot of 2019s, which you've mentioned as well, is the wines have an extraordinary precision, even though obviously the ripeness is key to them. What I like about them is the information in the wines is very clear. In 2019, if someone brings you a wine from Vosne-Romanée or from Champeaux or Gevrey, you don't have to be a genius to sort of pick where it comes from, because you know, the information is usually very precise. So they share a common ripeness. But then what I like is that the signature of the vineyards seems to have been is well maintained, and I think that's because they have a good acidity, and that, you know, it's what gives the signature to the wines.
It's quite an interesting concept that when we're talking about, if you like, lighter vinification techniques, lighter extraction, that actually in quite warm, sunny vintages, possibly we'll end up with more finesse in the wines, because they've been handled with more finesse to begin with. It seems counterintuitive, but possible.
I don't know if I mean, I just think you're keeping the finesse. I mean, I don't think you'll have, you know, I think the wines were well managed before, but I mean, in years like 2014, say, where you had a bigger crop and less ripeness, you certainly needed to make sure that you extracted enough, because otherwise you could be left perhaps with a wine that wasn't, where the information wasn't you know, as clear as you'd like it to be. But I mean, your point is a good one. I mean, that could be true, that that natural concentration means that perhaps people will back off, and perhaps the wines will change a bit. You know, the other thing I should sort of say, really, I think about our wines is this wine is still in the barrel, and I probably won't rack it. I won't rack it now till March, and it'll be bottled in April. So I mean, the wine has 18 months in barrel, and then just the one racking. And obviously, you know, I sort of repeat, you know, we're organic and biodynamic. There's no fining or filtration, so you know, I just have to rack it carefully, and the wine will be bottled, you know, as it is. I mean, obviously analyzed. And I think the other thing that sort of helps the wines gain in precision, perhaps, is that, I mean, we use very low levels of sulfur in our wines. I mean, as you know, I make some no sulfur wines, but this is a sort of classically made wine with a little bit of sulfur addition. But I think you know, when we shouldn't forget, we've had very healthy fruit. Yes, the yields are down in 2019 and 2020, but you know, there's very little disease pressure, and that's certainly important, as well as the perhaps the improvement in sorting tables and destemming machines, and that all leads to, I think, extra finesse in the wine.
Most of your wines around 13.5 in 2019.
This is actually 13.6, but what is interesting is the pH of the finished wine is 3.43, you know, which is actually quite low. I mean, for you know, for a wine post malolactic, and I think so that sort of that backbone of acidity certainly, and a good pH, I think, is sort of what helps to, you know, give it, you know, that freshness that I think we've all been talking about. But actually, the wines in 2019 are sometimes slightly higher in alcohol than even in 18. But it's really the concentration that has done that. You know, I never really thought of it as being a hot year. It was a dry year, but, you know, in some ways not excessively hot. I mean, yes, we had a few, you know, days, but.
Interesting. Well, I thought, as I said earlier, I thought that wine was showing beautifully when I was in Burgundy. But funnily enough, it's still showing beautifully.
Oh yeah, well, how's it tasting now? I mean,
well, let's say a lovely fragrant quality to it, lovely aromatics, and there's that purity of fruit, I think, and precision as well. You know, there's the intensity is quite subtle. It doesn't hit you between the eyes, but the persistence and flavour is great. So the concentration is clearly there.
Thank you.
The primary elements that hit you first are the beautiful aromas, and I think that's a lovely wine, and yeah, I look forward to drinking that in sort of 7 to 8 years time.
Exactly.
For those of you question, I think Mark, you are sorting out some magnums for us, so.
They're on my list. Yeah, extra work for me, bottling all those magnums. Yeah.
Yeah, don't forget to make them. Thank you very much, Mark. That was a real treat. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason.
Right, we better move on to wine number 5, and then we'll go back to Romain to finish us on our Grand Cru high. So wine number 5 is Cazetiers or Cazetiers, as I've spent 20 years trying to pronounce this correctly, but I think Cazetiers. I'll stick with that for now, and we'll see. So this is part of Charles Magnien Domaine, I spoke to him a bit earlier today because he wasn't able to make this evening, and he gave me a bit of history on the family. And apparently, the Magnien family is the oldest family in Gevrey Chambertin, dating back to 1498. So I don't know if there are any other families in Gevrey out there who want to lay claim to that honour. They've been vignerons though, much more since, much more recent, only since 1656. So not very long at all. So I gather, I was trying to work out the maths and the people's average age, but apparently that makes Charles, the current incumbent, 12th generation of winemakers. He took over from his father. He joined his father in 2009, and then he really was allowed carte blanche from 2015. So it's relatively recently. He has 7 hectares at his disposal, spread across 12 appellations. He recently added, I say recently, so the first vintage was 2018, I think, last year. A couple of wines from Coillot, Coillot Premier Cru and Coillot Grand Cru that we tasted last time at the Domaine tasting. He does a little bit of whole bunch. This was something he started to play around with. He has a special cuvee called Cazetiers, which is a blend of the very, very best bunches from his 4 Premier Crus, which are Lavaux, Estornel, Cazetiers, and I want possibly Champeaux as well, but I'd need to verify that. And that goes into this Cazetiers, which is 100% whole bunch, a very small cuvee. So again, has to be 100% whole bunch, a bit like Pierre Duroche's Gevrey Chambertin. Anyway, the success of that persuaded him that once he was allowed, if you like, to then start introducing whole bunch to the other wines. So say now he's generally working around about 20%, although there was a little bit more in this 2019. It's one of his bigger vineyards, at about 1.5 hectares. It's just at the back of his winery. And I think the thing he's most proud about, the Cazetiers, is, I mean, Mark touched on it earlier about some of the soil types. Apparently there are, and both of you may know, well, I'm sure you do know much better than I do, but apparently there are 4 key soil types within Cazetiers, and he is the only vigneron that has all 4 soil types within his plots. He has 8 plots in total, so he's managed to capture them all. And I think they're the same 4 plots, that 4 soil types that you also see in Crais, Chambertin, Coillot. So they clearly make quite a good combination. Other things to tell you about it. He said the evenings were quite cool around about harvest time, which helped the freshness of the wines. He began harvest around about the same time as Romain and Mark on, I think, the 12th of September for about a week. And I think he would have begun harvesting Cazetiers on the 13th or 14th, fairly early on. And the other interesting thing to say about this vineyard is some of the vines date back, well, they must have been replanted at the beginning of the First World War, I think 1915. So they're 104 years old for this vintage. They're not all that old, but I think they average about 70 years. So again, something really important in 2019, where there was issues with lack of water. These old vines didn't suffer at all. And so, yeah, just quickly come to the wine, really. He is someone, as I say, very quickly, we started working with him for the 2015 or 2016 vintage. So kind of his second vintage. And in a way, we kind of hope he's going to end up sort of where Pierre Duroche is in a couple of years' time. His wine's already getting a lot of really positive press from all the right people. And yeah, I think you've got on the nose, you've got that lovely minerality, purity, that sort of tail graveliness that I love about Gevrey. And yet there's a sort of consummate ease of concentration. We're talking with Mark there about it hasn't been forced, it hasn't been over extracted. Really good energy, plenty of structure and concentration. I'm just trying to think if this wine has been bottled. When I was there, he was actually bottling some very, very large bottles. I think some 9-litre bottles of this. So I can't quite remember if this was bottled or was about to be bottled. But certainly quite a special wine. 50% new oak and 50% 1-year-old oak, which there seems to be enough concentration to cope with that amount of oak. I think it doesn't get in the way. So yeah, another pretty special wine, really. And actually, bearing in mind, it's not miles apart from the Champeaux. It makes, as I say, I think it's quite different in flavor profile in many ways. But I really love both of them. So there we go. We'll leave that wine and then move back onto Romain. And Romain, the floor is yours. Perhaps we often in these tastings, or when we've done tastings with you, we've probably focused a little bit more on your Mazoyer rather than your Charme. I was particularly impressed with the Charme, not that I wasn't with the Mazoyer in this vintage. Can you just tell us the thought process behind the separation of those two vineyards? Because obviously about 20 years ago, it was all blended together to make one wine.
I'll come to answer to your question, but if you mind, I would just give a specific insight about the 2019 vintage. I would say that in that vintage, it was a little bit more stressful in the vineyards due to the fact when you're farming organically, with the heat, and there was no pressure of mildew, but there were higher pressure of powdery mildew. And when you use sulfur to fight against mildew, sulfur can burn the leaves when you use too much. And at the opposite, if you don't use enough, you may be not enough accurate to fight against the powdery mildew. So there was quite a little bit high pressure in stressful in the vineyard, I would say. Whereas as for the winemaking, it was really easy, probably one of the easiest winemaking, as Mark pointed out. We rather have to learn how to be hands-off these days compared to what happened previously, because when you just put all the grapes in the vat, so just after an hour, the juice was colored already. So you didn't need to struggle a lot just to extract those polyphenols. It was coming out very easily. One point as well on the level of the village. In hot villages, I've noticed that the level of the village are usually quite high, because apart from the fact that usually the yield are a little bit lower, you can reach a high level of ripeness for those village wines. And what is quite amazing recently, that's quite paradoxal, is that the acidity, it's not a high vintage of acidity, not like in 14 or 08, but you still have a nice acidity which balance and give the energy to the wine. And I think that's one of the reasons I've noticed, is that probably we realized 20 to 30 years ago that we have stopped bringing any potassium in the vineyards. And the soil now has gained in terms of acidity, and it brings back the acidity to the grapes. And that's why you were able to make wines which, even in hot vintages, get that high level of acidity. So which is really good, actually. I would say that the vintage is quite terroir driven, but maybe not as terroir driven as 18 or 17 could have been. That's my point of view, my personal point of view, anyway. Just to now answer your question about Mazoyer and Charme, we decided to split the vineyard in 2000, because I realized that they're really specifically two different parcels. The Charme, which is really for me a Grand Cru of Gevrey Chambertin, and the Mazoyer, if I would dare, who is really rather a Grand Cru of Moët-Saint-Denis. Everything is quite different. The type of soil, on the Charme, this is a crinoidal limestone that you have underneath. And the soil is very shallow, probably about between 10 to 20 centimeters of clay mainly, and then just below it's crinoidal limestone. Whereas in Mazoyer, we've just realized we have dig a hole in about 25 of our plots to just analyzes the type of soil we have. And we've discovered that in the Mazoyer, this is mainly a high level of clay and a lot of stones, coming from the Primeur limestone that you have underneath, bringing from the alluvion that's coming from the erosion of the Comte de Grisard. And so the soil is far much deeper than in the Charme. And in both vineyards had just been planted after World War II around the early 50s. We have been replanted part of it in the Charme. And in the Mazoyer, specifically, it brings up a little bit more, how do you say, Miran, more than in Charme, actually. And the profile of the wine are quite different. I say Mazoyer, this is more a Morel profile. You have more layers of spiciness, black fruit side, even sometimes some touch of floral note, violet, like the wine you can sometimes find in Lariot. Whereas in the Charme, it's more driven by the red fruit side character. And you can mainly pick some cherry notes that you could find either or as well on the Bel Air. So the profile of the vine, the profile of the vineyards are really quite distinctive. And I think they in terms of expression and character, they're, when you taste side by side, they really taste quite differently. So this is why I've really decided in 2000 to separate and vinify them separately.
Do you pick them at the same time, Romain?
I usually picked the Charme about 3 to 4 days before the Mazoyer. Because the level of ripeness is going a little bit faster, the soil is a little bit more shallow, so the ripeness is going a little bit more easier than the Mazoyer. Even if I have more Miran in the Mazoyer, and usually I have more grapes in Mazoyer, but in terms of yield, I usually end up a bit lower in the Mazoyer than the Charme. But yes, the Charme is always about 3 to 4 days in advance compared to the Mazoyer.
Something worth mentioning, because one or two of the wines we've tasted this evening have obviously kept a little bit of whole punch. Were you tempted to have a little flirtation with whole bunch in 2019?
I'm thinking of it, but I didn't do any in 19. And still, if you have a fruit that was really nicely ripe in 19, the stem was not necessarily fully brown as the seeds were. So this is not still my cup of tea so far, but I'm really thinking of it. I've made a little trial on the 20. So I'm going to see what's going to happen on that experience. But so far, no, I went this was this time. There is one thing I want to point out as well on 19. I had discrepancies in the level of alcohol. The wines ranked from 13 to 14.5. I have 3 reaching 14.5 and 2 13. So that's quite extreme in the same vintage. But I can tell you, I can defeat that you would not necessarily figure out which one's got the more alcohol level, because there is such nice balance in the wine that you can hardly say this one is a little bit more warmer than the other one. And it's probably a little bit more difficult to distinguish. This is one of the key things also that we have learned from 19. So this is not because this is a high of alcohol, if this is not exceeding 15 or so on, that you would necessarily find less freshness into the wines. And that's very encouraging and promising for the future if we keep on going with the evolution of global warming.
And in terms of, just finish on that one, you're around about 50% new oak on the Charme?
That's about 40%. Yeah. I'm not exceeding 40%, basically.
And generally for you, yields on 2019 were not too bad, were they? They
were not too bad, actually. I didn't have this 30 that probably most of the growers reported. I did about minus 15 to 20. So yield were not that bad actually. I had more lower yield in 20, and especially in vineyards that are close to the forest that suffered a lot from the hydric stress. But in 19, I did quite nicely actually.
And in terms of longevity, where do you see 2019 being a vintage for long keeping?
I think that's a vintage that can be for long keeping. You know, the charm you're just tasting here, it's a pH which is about it's around 365, so that's quite a high level of pH. But usually with the charm or Mazoyer, I end up with quite a high level of pH. I've realized that, you know, even if you take an 03, the 03 that survived really well. And I think, you know, you may sometimes see that you would make great expectation in some vintages that are high level of acidity, and that finally turn out to be drinkable younger than what you would have expected. You know, first of all, for the 08, I saw that would be in the way of 99, you would have to wait for ages before opening up any 08 because there was such a high level of acidity, and plus the structure was also, the wine were very structured. But finally, you're tasting some which are tasting beautifully nowadays. So, you know, and at the opposite, you're tasting some 07, which are really lighter in terms of acidity, and they are still showing beautifully, and they are still the ability to age for quite a long time. So I think that this is not necessarily linked to the level of the acidity, but there is also a question of level of concentration of all the polyphenol, not only, you know, tannin is one part, but the other polyphenol as well. And I think 19 is a good example of how wine can be accessibly when they are young and very good, and that are really good potential for evolution and keeping as well. I may be wrong, but that's my expectation anyway.
One last question, because we'll need to bring it to a close, and it's a slightly cheeky question, but excluding your Grand Cru, Romain, which is your, are we allowed to ask, which is your favourite of your Premier Crus this year?
Jason, when you have several babies, it's hard to make a decision. But you know all the character of each, of course. But I think that's, you know, in a vintage like 19, this would probably benefit a little bit more for La Riotte, who is a deep soil, Bel Air, which is, you know, above in altitude, and where you have not so much big stones, whereas at the opposite, Comte d'Orvaux, which has lots of big stones, may suffer a little bit more. So it's really mainly depend on the soil, the age of the vine, I would say. But I'm going to try to give an honest answer, and I think for the wines, I think Bel Air did quite pretty well, and La Riotte as well. I really enjoyed this wine.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you. That was a very I thought you were going down the politician route there of not answering a question, but we got two answers. So fantastic.
Try to be honest.
Yeah. That's a dangerous game. Dangerous game. Romain, thank you very much indeed for that. Also, Mark, thank you. That was really illuminating to hear your background on the Champeaux, and yeah, what a terrific wine that is as well. That's me done from well, I'm in Oxford at the moment, so I'll hand you back to Tom for.
I'd just like to thank Romain for making me aware that I was making a Grand Cru in Maurice Saint-Denis as the Mazoyer. This is news to me.
Never too old to learn.
Thank you so much for everybody who attended, and thank you for you who really organized those sessions. That's really very important educational, I think, as well.
Yeah, I'd like to say the same. Thank you.
And I think you did really well, Jez. And I think we could have been apart from it, and you would probably have done better than us. Anyway, thanks. Cheers, everyone.
Thanks.